The research outpost on Vethoran 4 was not a military base. It had no weapons, no soldiers, and no defensive walls. It was a small, quiet place, sitting on the edge of a dusty orange planet, surrounded by flat rock and thin air. Scientists lived there. Engineers. People who spent their days studying soil samples and mapping old star charts. It was the kind of place that nobody important ever thought about. That was exactly why Overlord Veth Skarun chose it. His fleet dropped out of fold space, just after the second moon of Vethoran 4 rose in the sky. 3 warships, dark hulls, no markings that any Concordat patrol would recognize easily. The Kethari were good at that, moving quietly, taking quickly, and disappearing before anyone could file a complaint. They had done it many times before. The Concordat was large and slow, and by the time its diplomats finished arguing about what to call the incident, the Kethari would be long gone. Skarun walked through the outpost himself. He liked to do that. He liked the feeling of moving through a place that had no power to stop him. His soldiers herded the researchers into the main hall, a mix of species, 12 in total. A pair of vile scientists, with their long gray fingers, pressed together in fear. 3 members of the Suan Collective, their small cluster bodies huddled close. A Kethari defector working as a biologist, who said nothing and stared at the floor. And 11 humans. Skarun looked at the humans last. They stood differently from the others. The Veil were trembling. The Suan were making soft clicking sounds that meant distress in their language. But the humans were just standing there, looking back at him. Not aggressive, not begging, just watching, with a kind of flat, steady attention that he found slightly irritating. One of them was older than the rest. A woman with short gray hair and dark brown skin, wearing a plain work jacket with no insignia on it. She had the kind of posture that did not come from a desk job. Her name was Mara Ose, though Skarun did not know that yet. She stood at the front of the group with her arms loose at her sides, and she looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they are already solving in their head. Skarun decided she was the most annoying of the 11. He told his soldiers to put her in a separate cell. The loading process took 40 minutes. The non-human researchers were cataloged by value and separated. The Veil scientists were worth something their government would pay for them. The Suan Collective members were tagged for bio-research interest. The Kethari defector was taken aside for a different reason entirely. The 11 humans were loaded onto the ship last. Skarun's second-in-command, a careful officer named Drevik, flagged them on the manifest as low-priority cargo. Humans were not a wealthy species by Concordat standards. Their home system was one planet and a few rocky colonies. Their military was small. Their government spent most of its energy on internal trade. Nobody important was going to come looking for 11 human researchers from a fringe outpost. Drevik did his job well. Before the undying verdict broke atmosphere, he ran a standard legal check, a quick scan through the Galactic Compact database, to make sure the cargo didn't trigger any protection clauses that could cause problems at the outer markets. Most species had at least a basic protection flag. It was usually easy to work around. He found Article 0 in the Compact archives. It was buried deep, filed under a category called Legacy Provisions Pre-Expansion Era. The timestamp on it was 83 years old. Drevik read it once. Then he read it again. His fingers went still on the console. He went to Skarun's command room and told him what he had found. Skarun read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a short sound that was the Kethari version of a laugh. He told Drevik that the provision was ancient, that humans had been a frightened new species when they wrote it, trying to sound important, that no one had ever invoked it, that the Concordat had more important things to deal with than one old clause nobody remembered. Drevik said, very carefully, that the clause had no exceptions, that the language was absolute, that it did not require a quorum or a vote, that invocation was automatic upon confirmation of captivity. Skarun told him to delete the scan from the log. Drevik did as he was told. He was good at following orders, but he kept a private copy in a file he labeled with a name that translated roughly to "in case." The undying verdict jumped to fold space and vanished. On the human colony of New Carthage, 3 relay stations picked up a faint subspace signal at the same moment. Two of them flagged it as noise and moved on. The third was monitored by a 17-year-old boy named Davian Holt, who was spending his night shift doing homework and eating cold rice from a container. He was not a trained signals officer. He was a student working a part-time monitoring job that paid enough to cover his school fees. The signal lasted 0.3 seconds. Then it was gone. Davian almost ignored it. It was short. It was faint. It could have been anything. A loose transmitter on a passing cargo hauler. A glitch in the relay array. Background radiation from the nearby gas giant. He had seen stranger things on quiet nights. But something about the signal's pattern made him stop chewing. He pulled it up on the screen and looked at it for a long time. It was compressed, deliberate, and embedded in the noise at the very end was a coordinate tag, a set of numbers he didn't recognize. Davian was not a hero. He did not know what Article 0 was. He did not know that 11 humans were locked in the hold of a Kethari warship, moving through fold space at that exact moment. He was just a teenager doing a job he mostly found boring. He copied the signal data. He wrote a short note that said, "Don't know if this means anything, but it looked weird to me." And he forwarded both of them to the Earth Concordat Embassy on New Carthage, which was a quiet building on a quiet street that mostly processed visa applications and trade forms. Then he went back to his homework. The signal sat in the embassy inbox for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Then a night duty clerk named Asha Ven pulled it up. She almost marked it as miscellaneous. Instead, something made her check the coordinates. Her face changed. She cross-referenced the tag against the active outpost registry, then against the last known positions of human personnel in the outer spiral arm. Then she opened a second screen and pulled up an archive file she had never opened before. A file that every Earth Embassy clerk received during training and was told they would almost certainly never need. Her hands were not quite steady when she opened the channel marked Priority, Obsidian. The channel had not been used in 63 years. The system asked her to confirm that she understood the consequences of opening it. She confirmed. Somewhere far above New Carthage, in a high orbit that no civilian sensor could reach, a very large, very dark ship received a signal and began to wake up. Capital Station Argent sat at the center of the known galaxy, like a spinning coin made of metal and light. It was enormous, large enough to have its own weather system in the lower rings, large enough that some of the older sections had been built so long ago that nobody could agree on which species had built them first. 47 species had permanent embassies there. 312 more had observer posts. Every major law, every trade agreement, every border negotiation in the galaxy passed through its halls at some point. The Galactic Concordat Assembly met there twice a week. It was, by any measure, the most powerful room in the known universe. It was also, on most days, extraordinarily boring. The session that morning was about grain tariffs. Specifically, it was about a 3% levy increase proposed by the Duan Federation on imported synthetic protein that the vile agricultural guilds felt was targeted at them specifically. It had been discussed for 11 sessions already. There was a counter-proposal on the table, a subcommittee report pending review, and 3 ambassadors who had requested speaking time for arguments they had already made twice before. Ambassador Yael Doran of the human delegation sat in the third row and listened without expression. She was 61 years old, with short silver hair and dark eyes that moved slowly and missed nothing. She had been the human ambassador to the Concordat for 9 years. She was known, among the other delegations, as the quiet one, patient, methodical, never raised her voice, never demanded priority speaking time, voted consistently but never theatrically. Several of the younger alien diplomats had privately decided she was a little dull. She sat still through the morning session. She said nothing during the grain tariff debate. She did not react when the Kethari ambassador, a broad-shouldered official named Veth Drun, made a joke during the recess that the Concordat was big enough to fit a few missing research teams and nobody would notice. He said it loudly. A few delegates laughed. Doran poured herself a glass of water and drank it slowly. When the session resumed after the recess, she waited for a natural pause in the grain discussion. Then she stood up. She did not request speaking time through the system. She simply stood, and something about the way she did it, The completeness of it. The stillness made the room go quiet before she had said a single word. She reached into the leather case on her desk and removed a document. A physical document, printed on actual paper, folded once down the middle. The room went very, very quiet. Paper was not used in Concordat proceedings. It had not been used in over 100 years. Every species in the room understood, on some level, that the deliberate use of something old and physical meant that what was about to happen was not a normal diplomatic moment. It meant someone had decided, very intentionally, to make something permanent. Doran placed the document on the desk in front of her. She unfolded it. She looked up at the room. She began to read Article 0 aloud. She read it clearly, in standard Concordat language, at a normal pace. She did not perform it. She did not add weight to certain words, or pause for effect. She read it the way someone reads a list of facts. When she finished, she folded the document again and set it down. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the room broke apart. The Kethari ambassador was on his feet immediately, his voice loud and sharp. He called it a procedural ambush. He called Article 0 a relic. He pointed out that the provision was 83 years old, written at a time when humans were barely capable of leaving their own solar system. He said, and he said it with real confidence, that the Kethari hegemony was a Tier 3 military power, that humanity had no fleet of equivalent size or capability, and that invoking an ancient clause was not the same as having the ability to enforce it. He got a lot of that speech out before he noticed that the old delegates were not reacting the way he expected. The Vale Elder Council members had gone very still. The Suan Collective's senior observer had its cluster bodies pressed tightly together, which anyone who knew the Suan understood meant fear. The archivist clans, the gray, ancient species who kept the Concordat's oldest records, had stopped all side conversations and were sitting with the focused, rigid attention of people who have just heard the first sound of something they hoped they would never hear again. One of the Vale elders, a man old enough to have been at the compact signing, leaned across to the delegate beside him and said, in a voice that was supposed to be quiet but carried further than he intended, "They remembered. They actually remembered." Doran let Veth Droon finish his speech. Then she looked at him with the patience of someone who had already heard everything he was going to say. She told him that she was not making an argument. She was not proposing a vote. She was not asking for a committee review, or a subcommittee report, or a preliminary impact assessment. Article 0, she explained, did not require any of those things. It had its own mechanism. It had always had its own mechanism. That mechanism, she said, had started running at the moment the distress signal was confirmed and cross-referenced against the missing personnel registry. Veth Droon asked her how long ago that was. She looked at him without hurry. 4 hours ago, she said. The clock started 4 hours ago. She sat down. Veth Droon kept talking. He talked about military proportionality. He talked about Concordat oversight requirements. He talked about the right of sovereign species to conduct commerce in non-protected sectors. He talked for a long time. He was good at talking. He had spent 20 years in diplomacy learning that if you talked long enough, you could turn almost any situation into a discussion, and discussions could always be delayed, revised, and eventually forgotten. But the old delegates were not listening to him anymore. They were watching Doran, and Doran was not watching Veth Droon at all. She was checking the time on the small device on her wrist, the way a person checks the time when they are not waiting for permission, when they are just watching something that has already begun. On the other side of the galaxy, in the cold dark of deep space between star systems, a sensor officer aboard a Kethari patrol frigate picked up a contact on long-range detection. He ran the reading twice because the first result did not seem possible. Then he ran it a third time. The contact was large. Not large in the way that freighters were large, or even the way that Kethari heavy cruisers were large. It was large in a way that the scale bar on his screen seemed to argue with itself about. It was emerging from fold space at a controlled, unhurried pace, like it was not arriving like it was arriving on purpose. The transponder signal came through clearly on the fourth scan. EDCISV, unconditional. The sensor officer had never heard of that ship. He reported the contact to his commander. His commander had also never heard of it. He reported it up the chain to Hegemony Command on the nearest station. One very old intelligence officer at Hegemony Command had heard of it. He had read a file about it years ago, a low-priority intelligence memo about a class of human vessel that had supposedly been decommissioned. He had never thought he would need to act on it. He pulled up the file with hands that were no longer quite steady. The file was short, but the last line stayed with him. Sovereign class. Built for one purpose only. Has never been deployed in a military conflict. Has never needed to be. He stared at that line for a long time. Then he began composing a message to Overlord Skarun that he was very much afraid was already too late. The ISV Unconditional moved through Kethari space without any attempt to hide. That, more than its size, was the first thing that frightened people. Every other ship in the galaxy, warships, haulers, pirates, even Concordat patrol vessels, used some form of electronic reduction when moving through contested or hostile territory. You dimmed your profile. You kept your power signature low. You gave yourself options. The Unconditional did none of that. Its power output blazed on every sensor in range like a star that had decided to go for a walk. Its navigation lights were on. Its transponder was broadcasting openly. It was not hiding because it had made a decision at some level, by some person or group of people, long before this moment, that it would never need to hide. It was big. Longer than most space stations. Wider than a Kethari heavy cruiser was long, but it had no visible weapons ports, no fighter launch bays, no torpedo arrays. Its surface was smooth and gray-white, almost plain, broken only by sensor arrays and what looked like large cylindrical structures along its midsection that nobody in the Kethari fleet could identify. It decelerated into standard Kethari patrol space and stopped. Then it broadcast on all open frequencies, in 47 languages, in a calm voice that sounded like it was reading a weather report. This is the Earth Defense Corps intervention and sovereign vessel Unconditional. 11 human citizens are currently held unlawfully aboard the Kethari vessel, registered as Undying Verdict. Release of all 11 individuals is required in full. This offer of peaceful compliance expires in 6 hours. We will remain here until it is met. That was the entire message. It repeated every 4 minutes. The Kethari Hegemony scrambled its fleet. It took 90 minutes for the first warships to arrive. Then more. Then more after that. By the time the full defensive response was assembled, 217 Kethari vessels surrounded the Unconditional, in a formation that every military analyst in the galaxy, who was watching the feeds, described as overwhelming. Ships of every class fast attack frigates, mid-range destroyers, 3 heavy cruisers that each outmassed most human military vessels individually. The numbers were not even close. Military analysts across the Concordat ran the math. They compared tonnage, weapons payload, crew count, firepower output. Every model they ran came to the same conclusion. There was no scenario in which one ship, even a very large one, survived what was pointed at it. The feeds from Capital Station Argent showed delegates watching on personal screens they had smuggled into the session. Even the grain tariff argument had stopped. Ambassador Doran sat with her hands folded on her desk. She was not watching a screen. She already knew what was going to happen. The Undying Verdict was deep in the fleet formation, well away from the Unconditional. Overlord Skarun had put it there on purpose. He was not a stupid man. He understood that if the human ship was going to do anything, it was going to try to reach the captives first. The fleet was a wall between them. He stood on his bridge and watched the Unconditional on the main display. It had not moved since it broadcast its message. It had not powered up any weapons because, as far as his tactical officers could tell, it didn't have any conventional ones. His fleet commander asked if they should wait for the 6-hour window to close. Skarun said no. Waiting felt like accepting the terms. He would not accept terms from a single ship. He gave the order to open fire. 217 ships fired at the same time. The space between the fleet and the Unconditional lit up completely. For about 3 seconds, that region of space was so full of energy discharge that sensors on both sides went white. 3 full seconds of everything the Kethari fleet had. When the sensors cleared, the Unconditional was still there. Its hull had a long, pale mark along one side, a burn scar, clearly visible. That was all. The cylindrical structures along its midsection were now moving. They rotated slowly, steadily, pointing outward in all directions, like the petals of a very large flower opening. A low-frequency hum went through every ship in the fleet, not through speakers, not through comms, but through the actual metal of the hulls, vibrating up through the floors into the feet of every crew member in 217 ships at once. Then the Unconditional activated the resonance shroud. Nobody outside of human military intelligence knew exactly what a resonance shroud did. The technical explanation, buried in Earth Defense Corps engineering files, described it as a targeted frequency cascade that disrupted the core oscillation of fold drive crystals, navigation gyros, and directed energy focusing arrays simultaneously. The practical explanation was simpler. Every Kethari ship within 40,000 kilometers stopped working. Not explosively, not dramatically. The lights stayed on. The air kept circulating. Nobody got hurt. The crews were perfectly fine. They were just sitting in ships that would no longer move, could no longer aim, and could no longer fire floating in space, like 217 very expensive pieces of furniture. It had taken 9 seconds. The 3 ships beyond the 40,000-kilometer radius were untouched. Their crews watched in total silence. Mara Ose had been working on the problem since the first hour aboard the Undying Verdict. They had put her in a cell 2 corridors down from the other 10 humans, apparently thinking that separating her was a precaution. It was a precaution, she admitted to herself, just not a sufficient one. The cell door used a magnetic lock with a manual override panel on the inside wall, probably added by a contractor who thought it was a safety feature in case of power failure. On a Kethari ship, it was a standard panel. On any ship that had ever carried human engineers, it was a problem. One of the 11 humans was a systems engineer named Tor Baines. Mara had worked with Tor on the outpost for 3 years. She knew he could take apart any standard electronic component with whatever was available in his pockets. She knew, specifically, that Tor always carried a multi-tool on his belt because she had watched him use it to fix a coffee machine, a door sensor, and a research drone in the same afternoon once. They had not taken the multi-tool. It was small, clipped inside the lining of his jacket, and the Kethari guards had done a fast search, not a thorough one. Mara communicated this to Tor by spending 40 minutes making noise at the wall between their cells in a pattern that was not Morse code. It was a modified compression pattern she had learned in her Earth Defense Corps days, one that looked like random banging to anyone listening from outside. Tor understood, after the 8th repetition. By the time the Unconditional arrived in system, Mara had her cell door open, had collected the other 10 humans from their cells, and had used Tor's multi-tool and a power coupling pulled from a wall panel to lock down 3 decks of the Undying Verdict from the inside. They had also taken control of the ship's internal comm system, which Tor had hotwired into an independent loop that the bridge couldn't shut off without physically cutting the relay. Skarun's crew was trying to reach their own engine room through a corridor that was now locked from the inside by people who had nothing to do but make sure it stayed locked. When the Unconditional hailed the Undying Verdict, directly bypassing all standard ship-to-ship protocols and connecting straight to the internal .com loop, like it knew exactly where to look, the voice that came through was calm and professional. "Sergeant Ose, we have your position locked. Do you need us to knock?" Mara looked at the 10 people sitting on the floor around her. Tor was eating a ration bar he had found in a storage locker. Seo Jun, the botanist, had a sealed sample case on her lap that she had apparently found in a supply room and refused to leave without. 2 of the engineers were playing a card game they had made from torn pieces of a manifest sheet. Mara pressed the comm. "Negative," she said. "We've already opened the door." The Unconditional docked with the Undying Verdict 17 minutes later. No breach required. The docking port had been unlocked from the inside by a former Earth Defense Corps sergeant who had then gone back to leaning against the corridor wall with her arms crossed, waiting. The 11 walked into the Unconditional's docking bay, under their own power, in no particular hurry. Skarun was escorted to the bridge of his own ship by 3 humans in plain gray uniforms, who were extremely polite and did not carry visible weapons, and still somehow gave him the feeling that the question of what happened next was not in any way his to answer. Commander Eli Voss of the Unconditional was a thin man in his late 40s, with calm eyes and a voice that had never once, in his career, been raised above a conversational volume. He met Skarun on the bridge without ceremony. He handed him a document. It was printed on paper. Page 2, Voss said. Take your time. The second page of Article 0 was 41 clauses long. It had no dramatic language. It had no threats. It did not say anything like, "We will destroy you," or "pay with blood," or any of the phrases that species used when they were trying to sound dangerous. It was written in the same dry, careful legal language as the rest of the Galactic Compact, the kind of writing that was boring on purpose, because boring language was harder to argue with. Every clause was numbered. Every clause had a subclause. Every subclause had a reference to a specific article of Concordat law that gave it legal standing. Someone had spent a very long time writing it. Someone who thought not about anger, but about results. Commander Voss broadcast the reading of it live. That was the part that the galaxy remembered afterward, not the fleet being stopped in 9 seconds, not the rescue, not even the paper document. What people remembered was the broadcast. Every Concordat frequency, open, unencrypted, no password, no subscription. Any species with a receiver could watch. And almost all of them did. Voss sat at a plain desk in the Unconditional's main communication room. He had a glass of water. He had the document. He read each clause in the same unhurried voice he used for everything else, pausing between each one to let the simultaneous translation systems catch up across 47 languages. Clause 1. All assets held by the Kethari hegemony in Concordat-bonded financial institutions were frozen effective immediately, pending review. Clause 4. All Kethari commercial licenses operating in Concordat-regulated space were suspended, pending the outcome of the compliance process. Clause 9. The command structure of the Kethari military was placed under external audit by a Concordat review body, to be assembled within 30 days. Clause 17. Territorial claims made by the Kethari hegemony in the past 20 years were suspended and moved to Concordat stewardship until the compliance process was complete. Clause 26. All Kethari diplomatic credentials at Capital Station, Argent, and every other Concordat facility were revoked until a new government structure had been verified as compliant. None of it was destruction. None of it was war. It was, as one analyst on a popular Concordat news feed put it that evening, like watching someone very calmly dismantle a building while the people inside were still trying to argue that the building was fine. The clauses didn't punish the Kethari people. They punished the hegemony. Its power, its money, its reach. The distinction was intentional. It was written into the document clearly. The people were not the government. The government had made a choice. The choice had consequences. The consequences were listed, in order, with full legal reference citations. By Clause 30, 3 Kethari colony worlds had already filed independent compliance requests through the Concordat relay system, asking to be reviewed separately from the hegemony's central authority. They had clearly had those requests ready. They had been waiting to send them for a long time. Skarun watched the broadcast from the brig of his own ship, with his arms folded and his jaw tight. He had not spoken since Voss handed him the document. When Drevik, his second-in-command, who had been placed in the adjacent cell, tried to talk to him through the partition, Skarun didn't respond. He was reading the document again. And again. Looking. The way people look when they are searching for the thing that was missed. The angle that wasn't covered. The clause that could be challenged. He didn't find one. At Capital Station Argent, Ambassador Doran's office received 63 incoming calls in the 4 hours after the broadcast began. She took none of them during the reading. When it was over, and Voss signed off, she poured herself a second glass of water and began returning calls in the order she had received them. The Vial Council Elder was first. He asked her how humans had written something so complete, so specific. 83 years ago. She told him that the document had been revised 11 times over those 83 years. Every time the galactic legal framework changed, every time a new Concordat trade regulation was added, the human legal team quietly updated Article 0's second page to match. Kept it current. Kept it airtight. Never told anyone. The elder was quiet for a moment. "You were always planning for this," he said. It was not quite a question. We were planning in case, Doran said. There is a difference. He asked her if there were other articles like it, other dormant clauses. Doran told him, very honestly, that she was not the right person to ask. He should direct that question to the Concordat's own archive system. The Soon Collective's senior observer called next, then the representative of the archivist clans, then 4 species who had border agreements with the Kethari and were suddenly very interested in understanding what was and wasn't protected under their own existing treaties with humanity. Every call was some version of the same question. How much of this did you plan? Doran answered each one with the same patience. She was not gloating. She had no interest in gloating. She had spent 20 years in diplomacy watching other species underestimate humanity, and she had spent 20 years doing her job anyway, because the job was not about being right. The job was about the 11 people who had been sitting in the hold of a Kethari ship, and were now, as of 2 hours ago, sitting in the medical bay of the unconditional eating standard ration packs. That was what the job was about. The hardest moment of the broadcast, the moment that traveled furthest across the feeds, that was clipped and reshared in more places than any other, was not a legal clause. It came when a Kethari general, who had been watching from a command station near the home system, managed to get a direct audio line into the Unconditional's broadcast and interrupted it. His voice was loud. He had the tone of a man who was used to making rooms pay attention. He demanded to know by what right humanity had prepared this document. He said they had never had the military standing to back it. He said they were a minor species that had been given a seat at the table out of charity, and that one successful technology demonstration did not make them a galactic power. He said, and he said it very clearly, that this was the action of a species that had been lucky, not capable. The broadcast paused. Voss looked at the document in his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. He said that the general was right about one thing. Humanity had not written Article 0 because they were powerful. They had written it because they understood something about the galaxy that the galaxy kept choosing not to understand about itself. That the only way to make a promise real was to do the work of keeping it before the moment arrived, not after. The general asked how they could be so certain the moment would ever come at all. Voss looked directly at the camera. His voice did not change. We're humans, he said. We don't plan for the best case. He went back to reading the clauses. Deep in the Concordat's central archive system on Capital Station Argent, an automated process had been running quietly since the moment Article 0 was invoked. It had no alert, no alarm, no notification. It simply did what it had been designed to do. It began checking the status of 17 other dormant provisions that were tagged in the same category as Article 0 legacy provisions, pre-expansion era, human-authored. It found all 17 intact. All 17 still legally valid. All 17 updated, quietly, over the decades, the same way Article 0's second page had been updated. All 17 waiting. For what? The archive system could not determine. That was not its function. Its function was to check status and report. It generated a single short alert that went to a human oversight account, a real person, not a system, because that was how the provision was set up. A human had to review it. A human had to decide what happened next. The alert said, Dormant contingency cascade initiated. 17 provisions flagged for review. Human authorization required to proceed or stand down. The oversight officer, a quiet man named Sergeant First Class, retired Cale Thorne, who had taken the archive review job because it was supposed to be boring, read the alert at his desk. He read it twice. He put down his coffee. He opened the first file. He began to read. 6 months passed. The galaxy did not explode. It did not go to war. It did not divide into factions or collapse into crisis. It did something quieter, and in many ways, more significant. It sat down and started reading. All across the Concordat and embassies, in legal offices, in the private studies of senior diplomats who had been in their positions for decades, people were pulling up old documents. Treaties signed with humanity in the early expansion years, when humans were new to galactic society and eager to get along. Trade agreements from 30 years ago, border acknowledgement protocols, cultural exchange compacts, Defense cooperation clauses. They were reading them properly, for the first time. Not skimming, not assuming. Reading. What they found was not alarming, exactly. There were no traps, no hidden punishments, no reverse Article 0 provisions waiting to be triggered. What they found, instead, was a pattern, a consistent, patient thoroughness in every agreement humanity had ever signed. Every document was complete. Every clause was cross-referenced. Every boundary was defined precisely. Every obligation ran both ways, clearly labeled. Humans had always negotiated as if they expected the agreement to matter someday. They had always written as if someone would actually read it. That realization moved through the diplomatic community the way cold water moves through a warm room, slowly, steadily, changing the temperature without making a sound. The 11 former captives had all gone home. Seo Jun, the botanist, was back at her university within 3 weeks of the rescue. The sample case she had refused to leave behind on the undying verdict contained 7 soil and plant specimens from Veth-Oren 4, all intact, all correctly sealed. She published a paper on the microbial composition of the outposts' surrounding terrain 4 months later. It was well received. She mentioned the circumstances of collection in a single dry footnote that became, briefly, the most shared footnote in the history of her university's academic journal. The 2 engineers from the outpost filed a joint patent application 6 weeks after returning home. The patent was for a power coupling modification that allowed standard Concordat spec components to be bypassed and rerouted, using only tools small enough to be carried in a jacket lining. They called it a Baines-Osei relay, in that order, because Tor Baines had built it and Mara Osei had told him to. There were bidders on the patent within a month. The others returned to their lives with varying degrees of normalcy. The Vale scientists who had been taken alongside the humans were released through separate Concordat negotiation and went home to their families. The Suan collective members filed a joint civil claim against the Kethari hegemony through the new compliance oversight body, a claim that, given the hegemony's frozen assets, was expected to resolve fully in their favor within 2 years. The Kethari defector biologist asked for and received immediate human diplomatic protection status. He was currently living in a small apartment on New Carthage and working as a consultant for a xenobiology firm. He had told no one what Drevik's private backup file contained. Drevik, for his part, had cooperated fully with the Concordat compliance review. His sentence, when it came, was administrative. He had, after all, tried to warn someone. Overlord Skarun was another matter. His case was still in process. The compliance review body had a list of prior incidents, things the hegemony had done before that had been filed, archived, and never acted on. The review body was acting on them now, one by one, methodically. Skarun had hired 4 different legal firms. 3 of them had quietly withdrawn after reviewing the documents that the human legal team had already prepared. The 4th one was still reading. Mara Osei retired to a small house on the coast of her hometown in Ghana. It was the 2nd time she had retired. She had meant it the first time, too. She spent her first month back doing very little. She walked on the beach in the mornings. She cooked her own meals. She slept a normal amount for the first time in years. Journalists tried to reach her 4 times. She did not respond to any of them. She was not a story, she had decided. She was just a person who had done her job under unusual circumstances and then come home. One evening, about 2 months after her return, she received a short message from Seo Jun. It contained a photo of the published paper and the words, "Sample 7 had 3 new microbial strains, named one after you. It's extremely resilient and slightly difficult to work with." Mara read it twice. Then she laughed a real, full laugh, alone in her kitchen at night, and sent back a single-word reply. Accurate. She was, by her own assessment, fine. She did not have nightmares. She did not replay the events in her cell. She had been scared on the undying verdict, in the way that any honest person is scared when things could go very wrong. But she had also been busy, and being busy was, in her experience, the best cure for fear that had ever existed. She did not think of herself as a symbol. She did not think of the 11 of them as proof of anything about humanity. They had done what was in front of them to do, with what they had available. And they had waited for the help that was coming. That was all it was. Davian Holt received a letter from the Earth Concordat Embassy on New Carthage on a Tuesday morning in the middle of a chemistry class. His teacher, who had seen the news like everyone else, let him open it. Inside the envelope was a short note on embassy letterhead. It said that the original distress signal had been successfully traced, that the personnel involved were safe, and that his decision to forward the data when he could have ignored it had been a material link in the chain of events that followed. At the bottom of the letter was a small coin, old bronze, slightly worn at the edges. On one side was the seal of the Earth Concordat, the globe, the two open hands. On the other side were two words. First link. Davian held the coin for a while. His classmates were trying to look without being obvious about it. His teacher was pretending to grade papers. He put the coin in his pocket and went back to his chemistry notes. There was an exam on Friday. The coin was good, and he was glad he had forwarded the signal. But the exam did not care about any of that. In the private council chamber of the Vial home system, Elder Sorum Vial, one of the oldest living members of his species, one of the few still alive who had attended the original compact signing 83 years ago, sat with his senior advisors and answered their questions. They had many questions. They had been afraid of humanity before, in a vague and theoretical way, but now the fear had a shape, and they wanted to understand it. They asked whether humans were planning expansion, whether the 17 dormant provisions were offensive in nature, whether the compliance process against the Ketheri was a test run for something larger, whether humanity had designs on concordat leadership. Sorum listened to all of it. He had heard versions of these questions from every species in the concordat over the past 6 months, in various forms. They were all asking the same thing. Really. They were asking, should we be afraid? He thought about Ambassador Doran, reading Article 0 from a paper document in a room full of people who thought they knew how power worked. He thought about the unconditional, arriving with its lights on and its transponder broadcasting, not hiding, not threatening, just there, present and patient, and completely certain of what it was doing. He thought about a retired sergeant eating a protein bar in a medical bay. He thought about a 17-year-old boy who had forwarded a signal because it seemed like the right thing to do. No, he said, and his advisors looked at him. He folded his long gray hands on the table and chose his next words with the care of someone who had been alive long enough to know that some things, once said well, did not need to be said again. A threat acts from desire. It wants something: territory, power, resources, and uses fear to take it. Humans do not act from desire. They act from principle. They draw a line, and they mean the line, and they do the quiet work of meaning it for decades before anyone tests it. That is not a threat. That is something the galaxy has very little experience with and has never known how to measure. The room was silent. We should not be afraid of them, he said. We should study them. We should understand what they understand. And we should very carefully make sure we have never given them reason to open a second page. He closed the council. His advisors filed out. He remained. When the room was empty, he opened his private terminal and pulled up the archive of every treaty, every agreement, every compact his species had ever signed with humanity. There were 41 of them, going back to the first year of Vial human contact. He had skimmed them at the time. He had assumed, the way powerful species often assume, that the smaller party was too grateful for the arrangement to hide anything complicated inside it. He began reading from the first page of the first document. Outside, the stars continued their slow movement across the Vial sky. The night was long and quiet and full of things that had always been there, waiting to be read. The galaxy had always known humans were dangerous. It just kept forgetting why.